Hi folks, welcome back to my video series. My name is Lai. Before we continue to talk about our today's agendas, just want to remind everyone, please go to the bottom of my YouTube video and click on subscribe button to stay tuned for my next upcoming video. In today's sessions, we are going to look into the Veeam version 11, which Veeam just released last couple of weeks. And the main features that are available on Veeam version 11 is what we call CDPs. You can now configure and protect your particular virtual machines to have an RPO of seconds. Before we look into how to configure the particulars, what we call Veeam CDPs, there are a few things that you need to take note in order for you to use these particular features. First and foremost, the only supported platform right now to support Veeam CDPs is VMware platforms. You need to make sure that you have what we call ESX or vSphere 6.5 with update 2 until the supported version 7 with the update 1. You also need to make sure that on both sides of your ESX host, the minimum memories that it requires is more than 16 GB of RAMs. For enterprise, it should be no issue, right? Then the next thing is you need to have what we call vCenters to managing the infrastructures of your ESX hosts, and you need to configure what we call clusters. Your configuration of your cluster can be in the same clusters or different cluster as well. The Veeam CDP does support what we call VVOL and also VRDM as well. And the most important things that you need to take note is, in order for you to configure what we call Veeam CDPs, you need to make sure that the particular workload is always power on. And it must not have what we call snapshots. All right. So if you have a virtual machine which always power off, therefore you can't use these particular features called Veeam CDPs. Right. Next, how about others requirements? Right, the most important thing is you need to upgrade your Veeam to version 11, and you need to make sure your licensing is Enterprise Plus. Right, for those of you who do have standard editions or enterprise editions, in order for you to use Veeam CDPs, you need to upgrade to what we call Enterprise Plus. In your environments, you can only have what we call one Veeam backup service to managing the CDPs. The most important things for the CDPs to work, you need to make sure that in your environments you do have what we call name resolutions. That means you need to have DNS, right? It must be able to resolve not only your VMware's platforms, you also need to resolve your workload plus the Veeam infrastructure as well. In order for you to use the Veeam CDPs, we do recommend that you have what we call fast networks. The fast network can be your local LAN or even your WAN connections between both sides as well. Let's look into the proxies. All right. So most of the times we'll call this as a worker, the one that process all the what we call the CDPs, right? In order for you to set up to have what we call CDP proxies, it can be running on virtual or physical servers, right? The best recommended is running on virtual machines, and you need to have what we call the Windows Server operating systems. At this moment, we do support 2016 or 2019. In order for them to keep all the changes, you need to have cache as well. We will first leveraging on what we call memory. The secondary, you will leveraging on this, right? The spec, we do recommend that the minimum is 8 virtual CPU or 8 core. The more the better, all right? And then in terms of memories, the best is 32 GB of RAMs, right? But all this is very subjective. It depends on how many VMs that you want to configure continuous data protections, right? The more the better. Don't forget, we do need some cache as well, right? Minimum cache that you should configure and should have is around 160 gigabit cache as well. For those network which are 10 gig network or higher, we do recommend that you configure the MTU to 9000, right? The next thing is you can you can share with others Veeam components, all right, as long as it's running on Windows operating systems. Okay, for those of you who play around with Veeams and you know about the Veeam latest capabilities, they just introduced what we call Linux repositories and also Linux proxy as well, right? But in order for you to use CDP, it need to be running on Windows operating systems. The quantity minimum is 2 proxies, right? One proxy on each side, all right, primary side and also DR side as well. Once you have identified all the requirements, the platforms, the next thing is how does it look like, right? So this I have drawn a simple diagrams represent 2 different sites. I have on the left hand side, this is the primary side. On the DR side, you have on the right hand side, right? On both sides, you definitely will have ESX hosts, and then on each other side, you need to deploy CDP proxies, right, on both sides. And then you need to make sure you have what we call vCenters, and this particular vCenters is managing on both sides, ESX hosts as well, right? As we already mentioned just now, you need to have DNS, right? The DNS must be able to resolve the whole entire infrastructures. Then you can start to deploy what we call the Veeam backup service, and you are running on version 11. Once you have done that, you add the vCenters. Once you have added that, you're able to install the IO filters, right? IO filters will be installed on all the ESX hosts, right? What this will particular IO filters will do is it will keep track the changes that happening on your virtual machines, right? So once you already configure what we call the CDP policies, you start to do replications. The IO filters will monitor the changes, right? You will send those changes into CDP proxies. CDP proxy, it will do compressions, right? It also allow to do encryption as well if you configure end-to-end encryptions, all right? So once it's reached, once it's transferred and reached to the CDP proxy at the target site, it will do decompressions. It will also do decryption as well and pass those values into IO filters at the DR side. IO filter at the DR side on the ESX, it will start to write into the target data source, right? So this is how the whole entire process of how CDP works. In case of any disasters, you can just execute failovers from Veeam backup servers. Without further ado, let's look into some demos. So the first settings is you need to deploy what we call IO filters. You can do that from the Veeam backup servers. Just select your clusters, and then you can just right click and deploy IO filters, right? So if you do have multiples of ESX hosts, it will start to trigger to install IO filters into all the ESX hosts on the particular clusters. Repeat the same process for all the clusters that you have and you plan to use for CDPs. Right? You can click on details to check the versions of your CDP's filter as well. Okay, that is also the place whereby you can do an upgrade as well. Next, let's configure CDPs. Before we do that, you need to start to add what we call CDP proxies, right? So this is the way of how to configure CDP proxies. Select your servers, put better descriptions to identify the correct proxy for each of the sites. Then you can click on next, define your cache on the disk, right? We do recommend the 1 GB of a cache for each of the protected VM disks as well. And click next all the ways, right? That is how you add the Veeam CDPs, right? Once you're done, repeat the same process for adding the rest of your Veeam CDPs that you plan to use in your environments. All right. So what I did is I already added all the remaining proxies. The next thing is I put a better descriptions so I'm able to know the correct proxy for each of the sites. Next, start to configure CDP policy. Right? For those of you who are very familiar with what we call uh, the VM replications policies, you have the same UI, right? Define the names, select your replica settings, network remaps, and also re-IP as well. Select the virtual machines that you want to configure replications. You can select the ESX host. You can select the clusters. You can also configure use the tagging as well. Click on next. Then you specify your target destinations whereby you want to put your replica VM. Right? We strongly recommend that you put into a dedicated target data stores, right, for your replicas. Then you select your proxy that you plan to use for primary site and also DR site as well. You can click on test, okay, to verify that you do have a sufficient proxy resources for these replications. Click on next. All right. All right. So this is the place whereby you configure your RPO. All right, which we already just mentioned. CDPs allow you to have RPOs of seconds. All right. On this particular screen itself, you're able to configure short-term RPO and also long-term RPO as well. Short-term RPO, all right, the retentions, you can configure for seconds or minutes. And then for long-term retentions, you can configure hours of days. So at this moment on the screens, I configure 15 seconds for RPO. Okay, I would like to have a point in times for every 1 hour. Okay, long-term retentions I can configure to have 8 hours and keep it for example, few days. If I want, I can also configure monitorings to monitor these replications. I can also enable scheduling when I want to enable these CDPs. And then for long-term retentions, I do have options to configure, do I want to have a crash consistent or application consistent? Do bear in mind, short-term retentions is only crash consistent. So once you're done, just click finish. It will start to do what we call replications between both sides. Right? So at the first times, it will start to transfer the whole entire things. All right, at this moment, you can look into the statistics. All this value is still 0. All right. So I pause the video and I resume back. So this is to show you that I already finished to do replications And at this moment, my RPO of SLAs is 100%. All right, we will continue to do replications every 15 seconds. All right, and if there's any interruptions or any issues, it will indicate on the SLA on the dashboards. Right. Now let's look into how to perform failovers. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the virtual machines that we already replicate using CDPs. To simulate some changes, what I did is I modified the text file, right? And I just put the value line test CDPs, all right? And then I save this particular file, all right? Remember just now we configure a policy to replicate every 15 seconds, right? The IO filter will pick up these changes and it will start to replicate every 15 seconds, all right? So just to show to you, this is what happened if I power off the particular host. There's some issues with the networkings. The RPO, the SLA will drop, right? And this is the current value we're showing 75%. Right, so we are ready to perform failover. Just right click and execute what we call failover. Before we failover, you can select the particular virtual machines, and then if you do have a lot of retentions, you can just select from the point in time from here, right? So I just playing around with the settings. I just moving around and see what's the settings. So at this moment, I only I have what we call one extension policy. Okay, we stop point. Right, it's only one. Right. So that is the fast walkthrough. Right. Then click on OK, click on Next, and I click on Finish. It will start to perform failover. So at this stage, your primary VM is not turned off. All right. So if you want to have primary VM to be turned off automatically by itself, we do recommend that you use the Veeam's DR orchestrator. All right. And you can start to configure failover plan. Right. In that particular failover plan, you can define to power off the source VM before you perform failover. Right. So not only that, you can also define the test that you want it to be performed, right, on that particular products. So I go to the DR side, I select the Oracle 11G replica. I console in into that particular virtual machines. All right, at this moment it's still power up. It will take a while for it to power on, right? So once it's done, then you can just enter the credentials. Right, so okay, in the credentials, and let's check the result. All right, so remember before we perform failover, we made some changes on the text file. So by right, the 15 seconds is already over. It should replicate the changes. So what I'm going to do is open the text file, and you're able to see the result. There you go. Then the next thing is I just want to make some changes on this particular text files just to simulate that I make some changes at the DR side. Will these changes sync back to productions? It really depends on your options when you perform the next actions. Right? Sorry about that. Back to the Veeam console. Right? You can select the particular VMs. You have the options to perform permanent failover or undo failover. We are going to discuss all the changes that we make, right? So remember that just now we make some changes on the text file, it will not apply to the productions. If you want those changes to apply on the productions, then you select permanent failover, right? It will power off the replica VMs, and then at the primary sites, you can check back the changes. Open the text file, right? So those changes is not applied because we undo. Right, so that's all for the simple demos about the Veeam CDPs. All right, please stay tuned for our next videos for those of you who would like to view more. All right, do remember to click on the subscribe buttons to stay tuned for our next video. See you next time, and sayonara.